Okay, a few participants are still joining us, but it's 1 minute after 1, so or after 10, so we'll get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the University of Michigan HRPP seminar series. Today, our seminar is, excuse me, Children in Research, Balancing Ethical, Regulatory, and Practical Challenges. Today, we have speakers, Dr. Professor Karen Goldberg from Pediatric Cardiology, and she will speak to us today about her research, some inspiration, implications, and considerations for research with children. Following Dr. Goldberg is Dr. Julie Lemaine, Professor of Pediatrics, and her research interest is in child behavior and development, but she's speaking today about the minors in research policy. I'll review some regulatory requirements with working with research with children. My name is Rainitra Reynolds. I'm the HRPP Education and Policy Coordinator. And then following my presentation will be Katie Hunchke from the Office of Research Compliance Review, and she'll be speaking about lessons learned in some of the reviews that the ORCR office have done in the research studies with children. And so we'll get started with Dr. Goldberg. Thank you for joining us, and we'll have time for questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Rainitra. And let me see if I can capably share my slides. Hopefully you can see them now. Thanks everyone for having me and for coming. And as Rainitra said, I'm going to talk about the inspirations for me and some considerations for pediatric clinical research from my perspective. So way back in the 1990s, I learned from Ed Goldman. He was then the legal counsel for the hospital and the professor for the research design and biostatistics course that I took, that it's not our right to do research. It's a responsibility to conduct research safely. And that's sort of a guiding principle for me whenever I'm thinking about a new study or helping new investigators think about a study. And this is for sure true for all research. It's particularly true for pediatric research, that we have a responsibility to do this safely. There is, for that reason, there's significant guidance and regulation for doing research related to children. And I'll touch on a few of the key items from my perspective, and you'll hear more throughout the morning. But first, I wanted to highlight how important it is to have a question that motivates you to work through the important steps. Sometimes people will call them hurdles or obstacles, but they're really important steps and guidance for us when we're working with pediatric patients on research. So important to be motivated by your question to help get you through those times. So what motivated me? Well, while some of you who are younger on this call won't remember paging through journals to find interesting manuscripts, but as a second-year fellow, way back when in the 1990s, I came across this article in the Journal of Pediatrics, and I was taken aback as I read this paper describing poor neurodevelopmental outcomes for children with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. While this cohort included only 11 children, they suggested that maybe stage palliation, the only approach to treating this disease, may not be worthwhile, and they concluded that quality of life outcomes must be considered when management options for children with hypoplastic left heart syndrome are being evaluated. And essentially they were saying they weren't so sure that we should be doing surgical palliation for children with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. And I didn't understand this from my eyes as a fellow because, these were the patients I was seeing. Not only were they very cute, but also they actually seem to be thriving. Like in this picture of siblings, you probably can't tell which one of them has heart disease. And so this led us to do an observational cross-sectional study of children with single ventricle physiology who had a Fontan. And we found that many were actually doing well. IQ is here on the y-axis and age on the x-axis, and you can see that most of the dots are within or above the normal range outlined by these lines here, though there were some who were one standard deviation or even two below the normal range. So it got our attention, but we realized we needed to investigate further. And over the years, many factors, I'm only going to talk about a few, have been identified to influence neurodevelopmental outcomes in children with congenital heart disease. Among them, a genetic condition, a congenital structural abnormality of the brain, the preoperative presentation, intraoperative approaches and perfusion techniques, postoperative complications, and socioeconomic status and social drivers of health. We don't have the ability to modify genetic conditions, though, or the structure of the brain, probably. It's important to mention that improved fetal diagnosis over time has likely made a major impact on reducing brain injury associated with a potential unstable presentation that comes with later diagnosis. But really I'll skip ahead. We really wanted to focus on things that we knew were modifiable, intraoperative approaches and perfusion techniques. So for those of you who aren't cardiologists or surgeons in the audience, during cardiac surgery, when the surgeon's operating on the inside of the heart, a technique called cardiopulmonary bypass is used. Blood's removed from the major veins and then oxygenated in the bypass machine, and then re-enters the patient through a cannula placed in the aorta. However, for patients with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, that group that we had studied before, one of the important portions of that first operation during the newborn period is to repair the narrowing in the aorta. And during this portion, so up here and up here, if you could see my pointer, during this portion of the operation, the approach used to assure a clear view of the surgical field is called deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. The patient's cooled to 18 degrees Celsius to slow the metabolic demands to protect the brain and other organs, and the blood's exsanguinated into the bypass machine so that there's no blood flow to the brain during this time. Doesn't sound like it would necessarily be good for you. So sometime in the fall of 2000, Dr. Rick Oye and I designed a study to compare a new technique called regional cerebral perfusion to that deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. And regional cerebral perfusion includes cooling the patient, like with DHCA, but while providing blood flow still to the brain and yet maintaining a clear field for aortic arch reconstruction. There were animal studies that looked good, and a few places had tried this in a small series. Seemed to be very promising that we could prevent brain injury. And so we proposed this study, the use of regional cerebral perfusion rather than circulatory arrest during the arch reconstruction of children with hypoplastic left heart syndrome who were undergoing a Norwood would result in improved neurodevelopment without negatively impacting survival or other morbidities. Actually, when we analyzed the findings, and again, this is a clinical trial. When we analyzed the findings, we found that essentially there was no difference between the treatment arms. And if anything, it looked like those with circulatory arrest did a little bit better, though not statistically better, than those who were exposed to regional cerebral perfusion. This was a single center study, and we thought about growing to a larger population, multiple centers, but it turned out there wasn't equipoise across our group at the time, our community of people working with congenital heart disease. And so we ended up participating in a next study, another clinical trial, another randomized clinical trial, and this was a multi-center clinical trial when we joined the Pediatric Heart Network to participate in what's called the Single Ventricle Reconstruction Trial, or SVR. So this is a study well known in our field. The goal of the study was to determine the best surgical approach at the Norwood operation to deliver blood flow to the pulmonary arteries in kids with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. So either using this Blalock-Taussig-Thomas shunt or what's called the right ventricular to pulmonary artery conduit. And this was the first multi-center surgical trial in the field of congenital heart disease, and the primary outcome was transplant-free survival. Also important, but there were several additional aims, including neurodevelopment. And again, so what was my inspiration? What were my important questions? And this was a really important question for me. Rick Oye was the chair of the study, and essentially the SVR study trial changed the landscape of our field, and not in surgical approach necessarily, but in growing the collaboration in our field of congenital heart disease. So through this trial and follow-up studies, we've had the opportunity to collaborate with teams from 14 other congenital heart centers across North America. More than 550 newborns were enrolled, and the survivors are now older teenagers and have participated in research through their entire lives. We've learned a tremendous amount, including about neurodevelopment. So here's just one bit of the data when we found that at age 3 years, when parents completed the ages and stages questionnaire for their 3-year-old child, there were no differences found between the shunt type that the patients had received, but we did find an increased rate of delay among the cohort enrolled in the SVR study. So you can see this fluorescent green line represents the percentage you would expect for a normal population to be behind or delayed. And you can see for all of the domains from the ages and stages questionnaire, significant percentages, about 15 to nearly 35% had some delays. Now, however, our patients are older teens, and we're designing a study for them as young adults. So to say, really directly for this SVR study cohort, the parents or guardians granted consent when the participants were infants, incapable of understanding the study. But now the patients should be of assenting age, and ultimately for that young adult study, those patients who were, signed up to participate from their parents will need to be the ones to provide consent if they choose to. So, and while children often appear quite capable, they're vulnerable. And as you can imagine, as mentioned before, deserve some extra protections. So when thinking about additional protections for pediatric research, there are a few considerations I want to highlight. And first, it's a slightly different calculation when balancing the risk of a study to the benefit to the patient or the benefit to a community. So if there is more than minimal risk, then the risk must be justified by the anticipated benefit. And important to acknowledge that the relation of the anticipated benefit to the risk has to be at least as favorable to the subjects as that presented by available alternative approaches. So for instance, in those surgical trials that I described, obviously having a cardiac operation is a pretty high risk situation, though in either case, whether the patient was having the new intervention or the standard of care prior to that new intervention, it was anticipated that that benefit to risk was going to be at least as good as for the available operation. So it's a lot of balancing of risk and benefit, and understanding what the options are for any particular patient given their underlying disease or situation. So, and if there is no direct benefit to the child, the risk must either represent no more than a minor increase over minimal risk. The intervention prevents experiences that are reasonably commensurate with actual or expected medical or dental or psychosocial plans for the child. Or the intervention will yield generalizable knowledge about the subject's disorder, which is vital, like crucial for understanding or ameliorating the disorder. So the higher the risk to a patient population of a disease itself, it's a little bit more tolerable. The risk benefit ratio may change ever so slightly. So it's important to mention like what is minimal risk. And minimal risk is defined as the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. The second issue that I want to talk about is related to consent. As I mentioned, the parents or guardians may be responsible for providing the consent. So the researchers are responsible for making sure that the language used in the document and the verbal descriptions allow for a clear understanding by the individuals granting consent, and whenever possible, that the child can understand the study enough to provide assent. Written assent is required when the child is deemed capable of providing assent. This is based on age and physical or psychological health. It can be decided in concert with the investigators and the IRB. And of course, if assent is appropriate, enrollment will require both the consent of the parents and the assent of the pediatric participant. So the parents, if the child's old enough and equipped to give assent, if they say no, then the answer is no. If they say yes, but the parents say no, the answer is no. So both have to agree. So, and how about for that, for those SVR participants in that first portion of the study when the patients were infants, only parental consent was required. When they were 10 to 12, our most recent study, I didn't describe that to you, but we looked at them, brought them back for evaluations when they were 10 to 12. The child participants needed to provide assent. And when we embark on the next installment of the study, the participants will all be over 18 and will be responsible for deciding themselves whether or not they choose to participate in the study. So longitudinal studies, starting in pediatrics and progressing to adulthood, offer that extra challenge. The fixed population is based on the parents' consent or guardians' consent. And ultimately, it has a lot more to do with whether the patient would want to participate in the study. And finally, I want to mention the special considerations for research in children related to compensation. So we think both for reimbursement such as family travel or maybe parents missed work, and for incentives to help make it attractive to participate. Those are the items that we're talking about. It's important to ensure that any payment is not used to unduly bribe or coerce or pressure children or parents to participate in research or influence the nature of their responses. It's important to take social and cultural context into account and consult locally about payment and other forms of reciprocity in research. And really important to be aware of the possibility of pre-existing expectations regarding research participation and the risk of associated disappointment, so that we work to ensure that payment does not directly raise unrealistic expectations. And I would say it's ultimately important that our compensation should make it possible for people of all walks of life to participate, and not to be so much that it compels people, parents, patients of lesser means, to participate more than for others. So it's a very careful balance when we think about the both reimbursement / compensation and incentives / appreciation. I found these questions as I was looking to prepare this sort of as some guiding questions to help think about payment. How will children's participation be recognized and supported financially? Will children or parents need any financial compensation or reimbursement for costs associated with research participation? Will there be any appreciation incentive payments for children's participation, and who would receive those and what would they be? Books and toys might be the right thing for the patients. Here at the university now, it's really encouraged that we use gift cards, but should that be for the parent or the participant? How and how and when will information or payment be disclosed? For us, it's always been part of the consent process so that we're upfront about it, but I guess for some, maybe it's only after the child agrees to participate, or even at the end of the study I saw is included in one of these questions. Have payments associated with children's participation been factored into the research costs? So of course, also really important to consider. So in summary, remember there will be obstacles and a significant amount of work to put together well-conducted research for anyone, and particularly for children. It's important to assure you're motivated by the research questions so you can work through any of the, all of the steps. Children are vulnerable subjects, and special considerations are required when enrolling children in research. I talked about the considerations that are affected by the degree of risk of the research intervention compared to the benefit. It's important that we avoid compensation and incentives that could prohibit or over-incentivize participation by certain groups, and important to invest care to assure that parents, an assenting child, and young adults can all understand the study. I wanted to give a special shout out to the research coordinators who and research nurses who work with our team, and pictured here with the exception of our newest nurse, Shayna, who I didn't yet have a picture of. And thanks so much for you coming and inviting me to give this talk, and I guess I'll take questions afterwards as a part of the panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldberg. So now Julie LeMay will give a presentation to us.
Thank you so much. Let me pull up my slides and share. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the research with minors policy here at the University of Michigan. I have about 13 slides. So you will hear this variously described as research with minors or minors in research. What we're talking about here are minors as research participants. I'm not talking about here the policies around minors working in labs as members of the research team, like pipetting or working with Petri dishes in a lab. We're talking here about minors as research participants. So this falls under the Children on Campus SPG, which is SPG 601.34. That SPG was created in 2014. And within that SPG, it states that it is the policy of the University of Michigan to promote the health, wellness, safety, and security of minors who participate in university-sponsored activities. It applies to children participating in university-sponsored activities and primarily, historically, involved summer sports camps and mentoring programs, as well as high school students working in research labs. The university policy requires training, background checks, and adhering to a code of conduct. And children who were participating as subjects in IRB-approved research were actually not included in that policy until 2021. And as of 2021, they're now included. There are 1,300 studies at U of M that include interactions with minors as research participants, and about 5,000 study team members that this would impact, and that includes faculty, staff, students, and volunteers. Some example scenarios that this policy is designed to provide guidance around are when a graduate student conducts a research interview alone in a room with an adolescent for an hour, which you'll hear in the policy they should not be doing. A year-up student brings a 5-year-old into a room on campus to do a behavioral experiment alone while the parent waits in the waiting room. A research staff member brings a 10-year-old child to a separate room to weigh and measure the child while the parent waits in the waiting room, and during that time, the child discloses abuse to the staff member. Or a postdoctoral fellow uses their personal cell phone to text 17-year-olds to recruit them and schedule study visits. Those are all scenarios that need to be addressed under this policy. So it was a modification to SPG 601.34. In September 2021, the SPG was amended to also apply to minors, meaning individuals younger than 18 years, participating as subjects in university-sponsored research. This policy applies to all university-sponsored research on and off all campuses, meaning Ann Arbor, Michigan Medicine areas, U of M Flint, and U of M Dearborn. And I highlight that just because the term children on campus has presented some confusion at times because it includes all university-sponsored research. So if it is a U of M IRB approved study that is taking place in a school in the community, that falls under this policy, even though that's not technically like on the diag. Study team members, including employees, students, and volunteers who interact with minors participating as subjects in university-sponsored research are required to do 3 things. One is to complete the Minors as Research Participants e-learning course. Number 2 is to consent to a background check. And number 3 is to adhere to a code of conduct and reporting obligations. And I'll talk about all of those in more detail in the upcoming slides. The Office of Research Compliance Review performs audits of compliance with this in the course of their usual auditing work. Individuals not in compliance are no longer authorized by the university to interact with minors as research participants. So what is the e-learning course? So this is MRP 101, Minors as Research Participants. Taking that course is required annually. It explains the background check and outlines the university's code of conduct and reporting obligations for interacting with minors as research participants. It is a 25-minute online course, and it must be completed within 30 days of IRB approval of the study and before interacting with minors as research participants. And then there is also an optional course, which is MRP 102. It provides more detailed information about child abuse and neglect and was developed by the Michigan Medicine Child Protection Team. The second requirement of the policy is a background check. The background check is required every 2 years. Individuals are identified based on information provided in the IRB application. The background check requirement applies to study team members who interact with minors as research participants and their supervisors. And that includes principal investigators and faculty advisors on student studies. Those individuals to whom the policy applies receive an email from Higher Right, which is the vendor that the university uses to conduct all background checks. And the individual must reply to the Higher Right email, which asks them to consent to the background check, and they have to respond to that within 7 days. Interaction with minors is defined as in person, by phone, by email, by video conference, through online surveys, through text messages, through social networking websites, internet chat rooms, multiplayer online games, or other forms of digital or social media. And the communication can be bidirectional or unidirectional. So a study team member texting a minor, even though the minor may not reply, is still considered interaction with minors. This policy is limited to study team members who interact with minors, because if the study team member is, for example, a data analyst, like a biostatistician who never has any interaction with a minor as a research participant, they are exempt from having to adhere to the policy. And then the third criterion, the third part of the policy is the code of conduct. So this is reviewed in detail in the e-learning course, and it includes a variety of principles, such as do not, outside of the IRB approved protocol, touch minors in a manner that a reasonable person could interpret as inappropriate, give minors gifts, interact with minors outside the research activities, leave minors unattended, take photos or videos of minors, use, possess, or be under the influence of alcohol, marijuana, or illegal drugs while in the presence of or when communicating with minors, provide alcohol, marijuana, or illegal drugs to minors, engage in activities involving sexuality, including comments, jokes, or sharing material with minors, engage in physical or verbal abuse, or use unnecessary restraint, and possess or use any weapon in the presence of minors. And then also included in the code of conduct is the rule of threes. So the rule of threes is as follows. It is that study team members are not permitted to have interactions with minors that cannot be witnessed by an adult third party, such as a parent, a study team member, or a U of M employee. This applies to all interactions with minors per the definition provided previously. A witness is not required when the research is being conducted by clinical care providers in the context of clinical care provision. Research at Michigan Medicine, however, must also comply with the Michigan Medicine Chaperone Policy. With regard to texting and social media in research, an additional individual should be included in the conversation, or the conversation must be recorded and visible to the study team. For example, it should be a study-specific texting or social media account and not a private account of the study team member. When the research necessitates that the study team member interact with the minor alone, there are several options. One is that the interaction could occur in an open public setting or in a room with the door open where the interaction can be witnessed by others. The other possibility is that the interaction can be video or audio taped, and the recording is then stored in a secure location accessible to other study team members. The IRB approval of study procedures that do not adhere to the rule of threes does not negate this university policy. And then an additional element of the policy is the obligation to report suspected child abuse or neglect or a violation of the code of conduct. So study team members may become aware of or suspect abuse or neglect of a minor through witnessing abuse or neglect, through the minor disclosing information, or through observing signs or symptoms of abuse or neglect. Study team members may also become aware of a violation of the code of conduct by another member of the university community. For example, if a study team member becomes aware that their peer study team member is texting with a minor from their private cell phone as opposed to something accessible to all study team members. If you observe or suspect abuse or neglect of a minor or a violation of the code of conduct, you are required to report it. The principal investigator or faculty advisor on student studies must be notified immediately of any scenario involving reporting and is ultimately responsible for ensuring that required reporting has been followed. A study principal investigator or other qualified individual with delegated authority must always be reachable immediately during periods of interactions with minors. So I'll talk briefly about the obligation to report suspected child abuse or neglect. So the way the reporting obligation unfolds depends on if you are a mandated reporter defined by state law. Mandated reporters are defined differently by state, and you can Google who is defined as a mandated reporter in the state of Michigan. But if you are a mandated reporter, you must immediately file a report with Child Protective Services, and you are not allowed to delegate your reporting obligation to another entity such as U of M DPSS. If you're not a mandated reporter by state law, you still have reporting obligations per the university. It's an expectation of the university that appropriate action will be taken. Failure to report will be subject to disciplinary action. You must immediately report the information in at least one of two ways, either contacting CPS and/or contacting U of M DPSS, who will contact CPS on your behalf. It is not permissible for any person or entity to stop an individual from calling CPS, and permission from any person or entity is not required for an individual to call CPS. Detailed instructions and contact information are on the Minors in Research website. Obligation to report a suspected violation of the code of conduct. So the mandatory immediate actions are that if a study team member witnesses another study team member violating the code of conduct, they must notify the study principal investigator immediately, who must notify human resources. They must notify the University of Michigan Risk Management Services, and if the minor is at risk of imminent harm, they need to call 911 off campus or the U of M Department of Public Safety on campus. Permissible actions are that you may choose to report anonymously via the University of Michigan Compliance Hotline. Not permissible actions are retaliation for reporting. And then additional considerations. So some have raised the question of confidentiality in research. So the obligation to report these things supersedes the expectation of confidentiality in research and any assurances of confidentiality outlined in the informed consent or assent or approved IRB protocol. It is permissible, appropriate, and expected that study teams provide research participants contact information to CPS when necessary, and certificates of confidentiality do not prevent reporting or eliminate the obligation to report. A copy of any report filed with CPS must be provided to risk management services via their secure website. It is not permissible to interview the minor and or family about any suspected abuse or neglect, because that could invalidate future interviews by trained professionals. And it is not permissible to notify the alleged perpetrator of the plan to report. And that is for the safety of the child. As long as you make a good faith report, you are protected by Michigan child protection law from criminal or civil liability. And then finally, new studies with minors, new study team members or study team members newly interacting with minors. There is a question in the eResearch IRB application that identifies study team members who interact with participants, and then that information is cross-referenced with an indicator in the IRB application that the study involves minors, and that is how those individuals are contacted via email describing their requirements. Within 30 days of IRB approval and before interacting with minor participants, study team members subject to the policy must complete the required e-learning course, consent to the background check by responding to the email they received from HireRight, and study team members who do not comply are no longer authorized by the university to interact with minors as research participants until the requirements are met. If you have questions about this policy, you can email researchwithminors@umich.edu, which I will note is distinct from minors in research at umich.edu. Minors in research is for high school students working in labs and goes to environmental health services. Research with minors goes to our office in the Human Research Protections Program within the Office of Vice President for Research, and we communicate with the Children on Campus team. But we exchange the information frequently with EHS, so no worries if you email the wrong email. This is the website for U of M research, and I imagine I will take questions during the panel. Nitra, shall I turn it back over to you?
Yes, and I will share my screen. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Goldberg and Dr. Lemang. I just wanted to reiterate some of the federal and local requirements and resources for children in research. So first, the federal law defines children as persons who have not attained the legal age for consent to treatments or procedures involved in research under the applicable law of the jurisdiction in which the research will be conducted. So just going back to the beginning where we have these federal requirements, the federal requirements don't state what qualifies as a child, only that the local jurisdiction is what will qualify for children. And so in the state of Michigan, that is the age of 18. The OHRP regulations have Subpart D, which offers additional protections for research involving children. And so there are 4 categories under which research with children can be approved. The first is when the research is not greater than minimal risk. And for all of these, the research has to have provisions for obtaining assent and parental permission unless those requirements are waived. Under 4 or 5, the research involves greater than minimal risk, but it has the prospect of direct benefit to individual participants. And so the relation of the anticipated benefit to the risk must be at least as favorable to the subjects as that presented by available alternative approaches. And then 406, the research involves greater than minimal risk, and there's no direct prospect of benefit to the individual subjects, but it is likely to yield generalizable knowledge about the subject's disorder or condition. The risk must present a minor increase over risk. The intervention or procedure presents experiences to subjects that are reasonably commensurate with those inherent in their actual or expected medical, dental, psychological, or social educational situations. And then the last category, 407, is research not otherwise approvable which presents opportunity to understand, prevent, or alleviate a serious problem affecting the health or welfare of children. So if there is no direct prospect of benefit and the research presents greater than minimal risk, then there must be this opportunity to understand, prevent, or alleviate serious problem affecting the health or welfare of the children participants. And there are additional requirements for that type of research to be approved. It has to go additional steps and go to the Secretary of HHS. Under the Subpart D, the requirements for parental permission state that the IRB shall determine when and to the extent that consent is required by 46.116 of Part A, which is the informed consent requirements for all participants, and that adequate provisions are made for soliciting the permission of each child's parent or legal guardian. And so where parental permission is to be obtained, the IRB has to find that the permission of one parent is sufficient for the research to be conducted. So the IRB is making that determination based on the information provided in the IRB application or the research protocol or both. One parent signature or one parent's permission is sufficient for research when there is no more than minimal risk, or if the risk is minor increase and there's a direct potential benefit to the children. For any project that has more than minimal risk and no direct prospect of benefit for the individuals, the IRB will determine that the permission of two parents or two legal guardians is required unless it can be determined that one parent is deceased, unknown, incompetent, or reasonably unavailable, or one parent has legal responsibility for the care and custody of the child. So in those scenarios, it's really important for the study team to ask questions in terms of the availability of the parent, maybe do additional follow-up questions if they just state that the parent is not available or the other guardian is not available, to ascertain whether or not additional steps needs to be taken to get the permission of the second legal guardian. For assent, this means the child's affirmative agreement to participate in research. And Dr. Goldberg mentioned this earlier, that mere failure to object, so if the child does not give affirmative agreement to participate in the project, then it cannot be construed as assent. And so parental permission, when assent is required, is not sufficient for enrolling the child in the research. So the IRB has to determine when children can provide assent. And again, the IRB is relying on the information provided in the IRB application and the protocol as to what the children's age, range, maturity, and psychological state should be expected for those potential participants to determine whether children can be reasonably consulted and provide assent. And the judgment on who can obtain assent might apply to all children in the study, or it might be on an individual basis, depending on the variety of the ages, the difference in maturity levels, and if the psychological state of the children might vary among participants. In those cases, the study team should have a way to assess the capacity of each individual child to provide assent, and that should be documented when either not obtaining assent or obtaining the assent of that particular child. For documentation of parental permission and assent, this should be documented to the extent required by 46.117 of Subpart A, so there's no variation in that. However, the IRB will determine when assent is required. They will also determine how and whether assent must be documented. So in some scenarios, oral assent might be obtained from a young child, and the study team will document that oral assent was obtained, either in the study records, and then how it was obtained, the time, and all that would be documented by the study team or the person obtaining assent. In cases where written assent is possible, the child will sign the assent document, and perhaps additional documentation might be required by the study team as it would be for adult participants, noting any questions that were addressed or any concerns that were brought up during the consent process. For children who are wards of the state or of any other agency, institution, or entity, federal regulations require additional protections for children who are wards of the state when the research is greater than minimal risk and does not present a prospect of direct benefit. So going back to the previous slide where the 4 categories of approvable research with children, those categories have implications for when research is possible with children who are wards. So under categories 406 and 407, the research must be related to their status as wards or conducted in schools, camps, hospitals, institutions, or a similar setting in which the majority of children involved as subjects are not wards. And there must be a child advocate that can sign for the children participants. For local requirements and resources, Dr. Lemaine just reiterated all of these, but I wanted to point out the reporting obligations. There was a question before the presentation in the registration about when to include language in the consent document about reporting obligations for suspected abuse, neglect. And so the rule for that language in the consent is when the study team suspects that the interaction or the questions are being asked might allow them to suspect abuse or neglect. So it might be the type of questions that they're asking. It might be if they're going into the participant's home or in any other way where they might feel like they could observe something that would signify potential abuse or neglect. But there is this distinction, as Dr. Lemaine pointed out, that there is reporting obligations under both Michigan Child Protection Law as well as the U of M Children on Campus policy. And so the language might be in the consent under either, but if the language is not in the consent, it doesn't, it still is a requirement to report, even if it didn't make its way into the consent for that particular study. And then there are local resources in terms of consent and assent documents. So on the HSBS IRB website, there are guidance information and access to templates, as well as on the IRB Med side. And so you can use those templates depending on which IRB you are submitting to. And both IRBs will have specialty consents for exempt research, biorepositories, etc. And I also finally wanted to point out that there is a new local resource on the CSP website on the HRPP main page where there are protocol tools for general human research protocols, qualitative human research protocols, and non-FDA regulated clinical trials. For each types of those research studies, we have protocol templates as well as checklists. And so the protocol template is what you would use if you're writing a new protocol from scratch. And you can use a protocol checklist if you have an existing protocol and you want to make sure that the details in the protocol reflect what's required by the IRB for their review. And so I'll provide a link to this page, and I just wanted to highlight where you can find them. And then in those templates, a description of what information is needed to describe the parental permission, informed consent, and assent process. And so now Katie Hunchke will present on lessons learned from ORCR reviews of research involving children.
Thank you, Rainitra. Let me just get these slides shared. Okay. Okay. So thank you. I'm Katie Hunchke. I'm going to briefly discuss some of the lessons learned during comprehensive routine reviews conducted by the Office of Research Compliance Review and some of the practical challenges and the related best practices in research with children at the University of Michigan. I will include a brief introduction to the Office of Research Compliance Review, a bit about our comprehensive routine review process, including what is assessed during a routine review, including in research with children. And then I will discuss some best practices in study design, best practices when obtaining and documenting permission of parents or guardians, as well as participant assent, and complying with minors and research requirements, as already discussed by Dr. Lu Mang. And then I'll end with some resources that are available at the University of Michigan for research with children. So the Office of Research Compliance Review was established in 2003. We primarily conduct compliance reviews. We have several different types of reviews, including focused reviews that look at a specific requirement that applies to certain studies, and comprehensive reviews that consider more broadly regulatory and institutional policy compliance, which I will discuss in more detail next. Some of our other key responsibilities include study startup consultations. These are voluntary 1-hour consultations designed for investigator-initiated studies that have received IRB approval and include a meeting with an ORCR reviewer to discuss best practices and preparedness to implement the research plan and associated tips and resources. Our office also assists with clinicaltrial.gov registration and results reporting for non-Michigan medicine studies. Whoops, sorry, I went too fast for a second. We conduct quality assurance and improvement projects and assist with the AHRP reaccreditation of the Human Research Protection Program, and we contribute to policy guidance development. So to go into a bit more detail regarding our comprehensive routine review process, we conduct these reviews for a sample of investigator-initiated studies each year. Selection is typically based on the following factors. If a U of M investigator holds the IND or IDE, we prioritize these reviews. We also select based on if the study is a clinical trial. We prioritize review of federally funded studies and studies that are greater than minimal risk, as well as studies with vulnerable populations, including studies that enroll children. This slide illustrates our process for a comprehensive routine review. Once our office selects a study, the PI and the study coordinator will receive an email notification with information about the review. We ask that you schedule a 1-hour meeting. This is often remote. And we ask questions about the study at this meeting to make sure that we understand how it is conducted, and we ask to review study records. Again, this is often done remotely when we review the study records. It typically includes documentation of eligibility, consent, parental permission, and assent documentation, records of protocol adherence, study logs such as delegation of duties, training certificates, adverse event and deviation logs. Of course, it depends on the study, but these are the common records that we would review. We will then draft a report with a brief summary of the review and any observations. This draft is shared with the study team to review for factual accuracy, and the IRB also has an opportunity to review. And then once we receive comments, we finalize the report, and at that time, the study team can address any corrective actions if needed. Once all have been addressed, a closeout memo will be sent to the study team. So through this process, the review is intending to assess the eligibility criteria are met as defined in the protocol, that the consent and parental permission and assent process are conducted as planned and documented. We also assess regulatory compliance, including special requirements for vulnerable populations, which includes children, and applicable state laws, which we've already had a little bit of a discussion of. These reviews similarly assess compliance with institutional policies, everything that has already been mentioned, including the minors in research policy and assent guidance. And as Dr. Lu Mang mentioned, we verify training for those who interact with children or supervise those who do, as well as assess compliance with the rule of threes, which Dr. Lu Mang detailed for you. These reviews also assess for funding agency requirements, such as NIH-specific requirements or Department of Defense-specific requirements for studies funded by the department. So this was just a brief summary of our comprehensive routine review process. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about lessons that have been learned or best practices that we have sort of come to find after doing these reviews. So, and this will be specific to research with children, although some of it will apply to other studies as well. So in order to ensure that the study is meeting regulatory and ethical requirements for children as participants, including obtaining parent or guardian permission and assent, it's important to consider the participant population as well as the research setting and the study design. So as you complete the IRB application, ensure that it is consistent with the protocol and that it makes sense for the population. The application is designed to help you meet the regulatory requirements and to document how vulnerable populations will be protected from coercion or undue influence. So you'll need to select children in section 9-1, and in 10.1, you'll need to explain the assent and parental permission process. And when you do so, you'll need to consider the setting, the timing, who will obtain permission and assent, and how questions will be answered. Consider what is practical for the population and the setting. For example, if you wish to enroll children in a school setting, you may want to consider other methods of obtaining parent or guardian permission other than sending a form home in a backpack. Consider other communication methods, if a face-to-face interaction is possible, or electronic methods for parental permission. And then when considering assent, there is guidance available that will help you consider if a waiver is appropriate, or if oral or written assent should be obtained. And again, consider the age, maturity, psychological state, and the nature of the research when considering what makes the most sense for your study. The IRB application will also require an explanation of additional protections. And as a reminder, submit amendments to the application and report deviations as necessary. And I'll just say one of the things to consider is if you should include some flexibility into the study design to address specific participant needs. So when you're obtaining or documenting participant assent and parental permission, ensure consistent language in the protocol, application, and supporting documents. So this helps with clarity and to avoid any confusion. If you say in one place you're planning to obtain oral assent for a specific age group, make sure it's consistent throughout your supporting documents and your application so that there's no confusion. And then if you're obtaining oral assent, make sure you're including documentation of oral assent in the study files, including the date and who obtained oral assent from each minor participant. Ensure that the study team is trained to obtain assent and permission and then document it consistently throughout the study. We recommend that each completed document is reviewed at the time it is completed to ensure that all sections are thoroughly and accurately completed and to correct any errors as needed. A best practice for corrections is one line through the error, add the correction, initial, and date. And then ensure that consent is obtained from participants who reach the age of majority. This was already discussed. If you have an ongoing study, thank you, Dr. Goldberg, for bringing this up. You'll need to obtain consent from a participant if they become 18 during the study, when there are still, ongoing interactions or interventions. So I want to just show a few examples here by using the standard consent templates and assent templates provided by the IRBs, just so you can see what sort of we're talking about when we want to make sure each form is completed thoroughly and accurately. So this is if you're using the standard consent template from IRB Med, this is specifically signature box E. This is what is used to document parental permission for for children, if it requires permission from at least one parent or guardian. That's typically how it is. Be sure that each line and fillable section is completed. You'll see there's the subject name or the participant name, and then the parent or sometimes the guardian name, signature address, and date of signature. And then this form asks you to select the relationship to subject. In this case, it's typically going to be the parent or legal guardian for children. And then if other, you can explain there, but that won't often be needed. And then the reason the subject is unable to consent. So in the case of minor participants, it can just be written as minor. So this is the box for the second parent permission on the IRB Med standard consent template. So as Renitra already explained, regulations require 2 parent signatures for research that's more than minimal risk with no direct benefit to individual child participants, but 2 parent signatures may be required by the IRB. And if 2 parent signatures are not required by the IRB, you can remove this box. And you'll see here it's similar in the sense that legal name, signature, and address of the second parent, as well as the date of signature. Now, if you're unable to collect second parent permission, or if you don't, if it's not possible, you can complete this below here. Rainicha already went into some of the reasons that, you may not need to fill out the second parent permission. So that can be filled out here. Make sure that this is completed or that it's removed if it's not required to be collected. Now, this is similarly the IRB HSBS consent template. This is the signature box for parent representative permission. Again, there's some gray areas here that give you instructions about what can be removed if it's not needed. Again, the participant name, parent name, relationship to participant, signature, date, and then the second parent permission is below. Again, you can remove it if it isn't needed. So this is the IRB Med Assent template for ages around 10 to 14. And of course, as we've already discussed, you can consider the actual population, the setting, and how your research is designed to what form you'll actually use to document assent. But this is the assent template that IRB Med has available. Be sure that each line and fillable section of the documentation is complete. So there's the form asks the child participant to select one box here, either yes or no, and then print name, signature, date, age, and then below patient ID and date of birth. If patient ID isn't needed for your particular study, we recommend that it be removed. And then below that, this section should be completed by the study team member conducting the assent process if the child agrees to be in the study. And it says check all that apply. So the first box or the second box should be completed, the first one or the second, and then the third box should be completed to document that the participant had time to have their questions answered, and then the name of the person obtaining agreement and the signature of the person obtaining agreement. And this is the IRB HSBS assent template. I did obtain the one for ages 12 to 14. There are also other templates available. There's some oral assent script templates available on the IRB HSBS website. So depending on the nature of your study, again, the participant population, it makes sense to sort of review a few different options. Be sure that each line and fillable section of the assent documentation is completed. Again, signature, date, printed name, and then if there's any optional sort of audio taping of the interview, etc., make sure that that's also completed. As we've already gone over, Michigan law defines the age of majority as an individual who is 18 years of age or older. So children who reach the age of majority while participating in a study must provide consent if continuing interventions or interactions are planned, including the collection of identifiable private information. So a best practice related to meeting this requirement is to track the age of participants and consider remote consent options if needed, if it involves remote participation or if there's no further face-to-face interaction. So in terms of the minors and research requirements, we've already talked about these. Dr. Lumang already explained these, specifically in the rule of threes. So I'm just going to give some examples that we've seen throughout our comprehensive routine reviews to comply with these rule of threes. Frequently, the parent or guardian is present during an interaction. If it's in person or even remote, there's often a parent or guardian present during an interaction. Or sometimes 2 researchers are present during interviews or other interactions. Again, this is in person or virtual. Oftentimes focus groups are used to ensure that other adult witnesses are present. Also for texting, Dr. Lumang explained like this policy applies to all interaction with minors. So if part of the research plan involves texting or other interaction, include additional adult researchers in text, use a study issued device and or account. Also retaining recordings of interactions with children in a secure location that's accessible to study team members helps fulfill these requirements. And then we recommend as a best practice that you include documentation of who attends interviews or meetings with minors and study records so that it's very well documented when an adult witness is present. So this is a list of resources that are available at the University of Michigan for research with children. Renitra already talked about the assent templates that IRB Med and IRB HSBS have. These are some guidelines and templates here again. And then ORCR also has self-assessment tools. This allows the study team to self-assess for compliance. We also have study and participant level templates. So if you need, for instance, a document where you can document the oral assent process, we have some templates that could be purposed for your specific study and documenting that process, or eligibility criteria, as well as protocol adherence. We have templates that you can use for that for your study. We also offer study startup consultations, which I mentioned earlier. You can contact our office, usually prior to enrollment, for investigator-initiated studies that have already received IRB approval. And then, as already mentioned too, the minors as research participants policy, including frequently asked questions, is available at that website. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks for the overview of ORCR reviews and some real practical tips for meeting those requirements. So now we'll open up for questions. The audience can please use Q&A to address questions to individual speakers or general questions you might have. We did have one, and I'll ask Dr. Lemang if you want to answer this question. It was about the difference between mandatory reporters and the code of conduct, the distinction between those two.
Yeah, so I would say that being a mandatory reporter is state law. So state law in Michigan, and it mandates that you report if you suspect child abuse or neglect. The code of conduct is different and is a University of Michigan specific policy. As Katie was just referring to, for example, it includes not being alone in a room with a minor, so the rule of threes. So I would say they are two separate concepts. One is how the University of Michigan expects you to interact with minors, and the other is state law about being mandated to report. I guess I would say if you're asking about within the code of conduct, the expectation that if you're not a mandatory reporter, that you report suspected child abuse or neglect to CPS or DPSS, I would say that what might trigger you to make such a report should not differ between the two. I will also emphasize that we have been very clear that we do not expect researchers to develop expertise in identifying or recognizing abuse or neglect in some cases. And if you were interested in learning more about that, that is what that the optional course is, the second optional course that you're not required to take, but it provides a little bit more detail about recognizing abuse or neglect. I would say, in summary, if you are in doubt, you report it. And the rule is that you report if you suspect, not if you know. And it's not your job to know. It's only if you suspect. And I often tell people if every report that you are submitting is being substantiated, you are not reporting enough. Karen, I see you nodding in agreement with me a lot. Did you, as a practicing pediatrician who knows a lot about these things, did you want to comment at all or add anything?
No, I just completely agree. I think that if you have a question, if you're uncertain, there's no harm done by reporting. No one who has not been abusive will resent that or be upset. Everyone's looking out for, if with the intent that everybody is looking out for children.
I have my own question for clarification. You stated that it's possible to report anonymously, but that's if you feel that someone in the research community at U of M has violated the code of conduct. but is it possible to report anonymously if you suspect child abuse or neglect from a parent or guardian?
So if you suspect child abuse or neglect and you call Child Protective Services, it is the law that they need to keep your identity confidential, and they will not tell the parent who reported it. And I didn't put this in the slides, but for that reason, it is good practice that if someone, for example, were to call your research lab number and say, did you report me to Child Protective Services? Best practice is to say, the law says that we just do not tell people if we report or not. And the reason for that is that, you know, you're protecting your fellow reporters. If people go through the process of elimination and they're calling all these different people to ask, did you report me? And so you are protected. But they need to know who you are that witnessed or suspected the abuse or neglect so that they can collect more information about it. And so they do record your information to have in their database. Karen, did you have anything else to add about that?
Thank you.
I think you covered it.
So there's just a comment and question about recording and slides. Those will be made available. Also a comment that this is a great session, lots of detail, and thanks to the presenters. There's another question about, is there a minimum age of assent? And there is not. So generally at U of M, we suspect that you can start thinking about assent around age 6 or 7. But it's totally up to the researcher to determine whether or not they feel like assent is possible at a younger age, and then they can present that to the IRB to judge whether or not assent is required. So assent can be oral, and so asking a 4-year-old if they'd like to, try and read a book is totally appropriate. And so there's not a minimum age that we require, but you'll have to justify not wanting to get assent for any age. And so it can be based on maturity and the context of the research. There's another question with respect to when a child reaches age of majority. Can I request a waiver of consent for when a child reaches age of majority so that I do not have to reconsent the participant? So it is possible to request a waiver of consent for children who reach the age of majority. Sometimes at the beginning of the study, you might know that the child participants will reach the age of 18 when there's no further planned contact or interaction. And so the regular criteria for a waiver will have to be met, that it's minimal risk, and et cetera. And you can certainly find out later, once a study is ongoing, that you want to make that request and submit it as an amendment. So it's possible to make the request, and it's up to the IRB to determine whether it's appropriate to grant that waiver or not. Are there any other questions? We'll give it a few seconds for any additional questions to pop into the Q&A. Can a parent give permission for a medical chart review without getting consent or HIPAA authorization from the child? Does it depend on the age of the child? So I believe you might be asking if the study is limited to medical chart review and there's no interaction with the child. So I'm going to assume that's the question you're asking. If not, please follow up. But a child can't, or a parent can give permission, and you can request a waiver of assent for a medical chart review if the parent signs for HIPAA authorization and parental permission. For an older child, you might need to justify why you're not getting the assent of that child.
Usually, though, for medical record review, that's not a study that would require consent, though, right? Consent or assent, and we do a retrospective study that doesn't require consent or assent.
Yeah, the request for a waiver will have to be granted.
I think if sensitive information were being collected, then that would be the an exception. Is that right, Nitra?
Yes.
Just to make sure I was straight.
And so another attendee said, it was my understanding that children cannot give HIPAA authorization. Is that correct? And that's correct. They're not of legal age to give consent in that way. So it's a parent's permission. These are good questions. So any other questions or comments from the panel that you'd like to offer as parting words? So if we don't have any more questions arise, I will make the video recording available and share the slides with those who weren't able to attend, for those who want to review the slides. Thank you so much to the presenters. This was very helpful and interesting, especially hearing about your research, Dr. Goldberg. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.